Okay. Hi, everybody. Hola a todos. Vamos a comenzar en español. Antes que nada, una pequeña introducción. Lo primero, la verdad es que quisiera dar este mensaje en estos tiempos difíciles antes de empezar. Hay mucha gente en el mundo que está sufriendo en este momento y no somos insensibles a esto de ninguna manera, todo lo contrario. Sin embargo, la vida continúa y les deseamos a todos una curación rápida y que todos ustedes que nos acompañan, que nadie se contagie, que todos estemos sanos y que aprendamos pronto lo que tenemos que aprender de toda esta prueba para que podamos salvarnos de ella y que acabe lo más pronto posible. Quiero agradecerles a todos que estar con nosotros. Moxo México les agradece muchísimo. Apreciamos mucho su tiempo y su interés. Realmente es un privilegio estar en esta presentación para esta entrevista que es de dos de los titanes del mundo sobre déficit de atención. Tenemos a Sam Goldstein, el doctor Sam Goldstein. I'm gonna start with English. He's one of the biggest in the world, as you know. He's an editor-in-chief of the Journal of Attention Disorders. He's the clinical director of Neurology Learning and Behavior Center. They evaluate more than 300 people a year. He's the author of more than 50 books and 70 articles, scientific articles of world level, as you know. He's the author of a few, not very few, some neuropsychological tests, and he's in the chief scientific director of Neurotech. En español, el jefe del Consejo Científico de Neurotech. Tenemos también a Julio. No estoy muy seguro si nos va a poder acompañar. Parece que tuvo un problema técnico, así que por el momento vamos a continuar sin él, pero igual lo presento. Julio Flores es el director principal de la batería de funciones ejecutivas BANFE. Es el investigador nivel 2 en el CONACYT, expresidente del Consejo Mexicano de Neuropsicología, autor de decenas de publicaciones de primer nivel a nivel mundial, y seguramente todos han escuchado de él. Espero que nos pueda acompañar, pero por el momento vamos a empezar. Entonces, tenemos algunas preguntas para hacerle a Sam. Vamos a empezar en inglés. Sam, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I'm very glad you join us and you're with us. I hope we can cover most of the questions we have. So we're gonna start with the first question. The question, Julio, estás con nosotros.
Hello.
Hello, Julio.
I don't know if the microphone makes a lot of noise for you or it's okay.
It makes noise, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna turn off. I will only turn on for make some questions, okay?
Uy, se fue la voz. We don't hear you.
Right, so I guess he'll participate by listening, I guess.
Yes.
And do you want me to?
I'm gonna ask for you, Julio. I ask for your permission to continue with your questions. These are Julio questions, so I'm just speaking for him. So the first question is, what are the actual notions about ADHD, heterogeneity, sex differences, comorbidity? What are the new trends today about ADHD?
Well, that probably would be an entire day-long workshop. But maybe we should lay some foundation. My understanding is that most of the people attending tonight are therapists, and they're confronted with trying to help people, regardless of any age, with a broad range of life problems, who may have difficulty sustaining attention, or may respond without thinking, or may have a difficult time sitting through a traditional therapy visit. What I'd like participants to understand is that before we had the term ADHD or hyperactivity, or we once called it the fidgeties, believe it or not, people move around a lot, can't sit still, there were people who had trouble like this. And the real question we need to answer is not what do we call it, but what is it? And what we understand is that self-control or self-discipline is something that children acquire as they mature and grow, but we are not computers. We are not in a movie like The Matrix where they program us. Maturation takes place at different paces, at different speeds, and some children struggle to develop self-discipline. And if you struggle to develop that kind of self-discipline, and everyone else can sit in a class or finish the work or sit through a meal or sit still in the car, but your nervous system is such that you're too immature yet to do it, it causes a host of problems. Self-discipline is a critical component in everything we do. So if you look at, let's say, children who are having problems, whether they're anxious, worried, whether they're depressed or unhappy, whether they have learning problems, whether they have autism or social problems, all of those children will demonstrate difficulty paying attention and sitting still. Not all of those children have ADHD or I believe in Spanish TDAH. They don't all suffer from that disorder. But it is a delay in developing self-discipline. And the more we study it, the better we understand. We know there's a genetics basis, but biology is not destiny. Saying that there's genetics to it doesn't mean the environment and experience doesn't play a role. We know it affects boys more than girls. Girls develop self-discipline at younger ages, but girls also develop better executive functioning at younger ages. Girls also develop better intellect at younger ages, believe it or not. Girls at every age growing up are a little bit smarter than boys. So it isn't surprising that in our complex society, paying attention, sitting still, controlling your impulses, developing what we call good self-discipline or good executive functioning is very important. And children who struggle with that have a broad range of problems, and we've chosen to describe those behaviors as falling under the clinical umbrella of ADHD.
Great. The truth is that I lost the connection for a while, so I couldn't hear the whole answer.
It was a very good answer.
I like to ask Dr. Sam about the girls in his perspective, in his experience. What about with detecting the girls as early as possible? How is it becoming better or changing?
Okay, so one of the questions we've had is, should we compare boys to boys and girls to girls? The diagnostic criteria in the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, or the DSM, the American version, does not make a diagnostic distinction. But in fact, girls with fewer symptoms and less severity of symptoms with ADHD may actually have as much or more trouble than boys with more symptoms. So it's been an ongoing concern about identifying girls. If girls have fewer problems, then should we use a combined sample to identify the condition, if we do that, we're going to have more boys. If we use a sample of boys compared to boys, girls compared to girls, we're going to have an equal number. If we control for parent education, believe it or not, the more educated parents are, the more critical they are of their children's behavior, such that college graduate parents are very much more likely to complain about behaviors related to ADHD and executive function than high school graduate parents. So when you complete an evaluation, should you use normative data based on the parents' college degrees? Should you use it based upon where the parents live, their ethnicity, their socioeconomic status? These are ongoing questions. What we try and do is use what we call a match of the census. We try and have a population in our study that matches the percentage of people with college degrees or high school degrees, that matches the percentage of people with different ethnic backgrounds. In research, we call it washing out the differences. But that's why we have more girls than boys. If the diagnostic criteria would create a separate set of symptom counts and symptom types for girls, we would have just as many girls who have trouble developing effective self-discipline and functioning as we do boys.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and I think your question, Julio, speaks to early identification. You know, now with autism, we're looking at younger and younger ages, trying to find certain behaviors, like the child doesn't like to be held or they have trouble rolling over. We've tried to do that with ADHD. The problem is that most 2 to 3 year olds behave in a way that makes it appear that they all have ADHD, because most 2 to 3 year olds don't have good self-discipline, and they're very emotional, and they're very restless. In one of our tests that we developed, we found that we couldn't identify problems in 4 to 5 year old children with attention and behavior and impulse control particularly well, because there's such a broad range of what's normal. After age 5, as the brain matures, then you begin to see more acute differences. But there's no doubt that younger children can easily be overdiagnosed with any of our conditions if you're not careful.
Yeah, that's why it's very important to attend to a specialist, right? Yeah. In your experience, yes.
I think your comment about a specialist, I think, isn't so much about the letters after their name. Are they a PhD or an MD? But do they have sufficient training? I know speech pathologists who are very good at childhood diagnosis. I know other social workers and psychologists who are not very good. I know some who simply take a list of symptoms and ask the parents yes or no. And based on the count, they say, yes, you have this disorder or that disorder. I know some clinicians who use questionnaires, and questionnaires are good for identifying broad problems or narrow problems like anxiety. But if you rely solely on the questionnaire, you're likely to have too many false positives, and you may have some false negatives. Questionnaires are not a substitute for the clinician or the evaluator. Tests are not a substitute for the clinician or the evaluator. All of this information has to be distilled through a human brain, a brain that is well-trained and understands how to avoid overdiagnosis and how to avoid, underdiagnosis. The risk with ADHD is overdiagnosis, because those of you that are listening, I'll bet there's never been a time when a parent tells you their child is hyperactive and impulsive and inattentive, and you say, oh, they don't have ADHD. The risk is overdiagnosis, not underdiagnosis. The risk is not taking enough time to understand and evaluate. So in our clinic, when a child comes in, the parent may request, I want to know if my child has ADHD, and I respect that, and I'll answer their question, but I help them understand, first we want to understand this child's development, and that the end point is not a label. And children with a broad range of problems will have trouble with attention or mood regulation or impulsive behavior, and it takes a well-trained clinician. I think it takes a neuropsychologist, because I think neuropsychologists are trained to understand process, aren't as concerned about diagnostic labels. But I have plenty of clinical psychology colleagues who do a very good job of evaluation. But I don't think you can evaluate for ADHD without asking about the child's cognitive development, their academic development, their emotional development, their social development, because symptoms of ADHD overlap so much with these other conditions.
Your position about the training is very important, because I know most neuropsychologists in Latin America doesn't know how to evaluate autism or diagnose it, even though they have a specialty in neuropsychology. And what is your experience in your college, with your psychology college, with autism?
So I'm not sure that I heard all of your question, but you were asking about ADHD and autism?
I'm talking about the level of training, that your college and the professionals in the U.S. have about detecting autism comparing to ADHD.
So your question is about training. Do people have more training? What the level of training is to evaluate ADHD versus evaluating autism?
In your experience, it's harder to evaluate autism than ADHD, for example?
Okay. Okay. So let me tell you something Jack Neglieri and I have completed what is the largest epidemiologic sample looking at autism in the population. And we're doing a second big study now with adults all the way through age 80. And what we have demonstrated is that symptoms of ADHD co-occur in children with autism, especially children with normal intelligence and autism, at a very high rate. More than half the children with normal intellect autism also meet diagnostic criteria for ADHD. Another 20 or 30% have enough symptoms of ADHD that it causes them impairment. So from my view, children with autism and children with ADHD overlap in those symptoms, but are very different in their social communication, where children with ADHD don't have a problem. They know what to do, but they're impulsive and socially don't do what they know. Children with autism don't know what to do. And children with autism have idiosyncrasies and odd or atypical behavior. Children with ADHD do not have that. So it's not difficult to understand from these data why more than half the children in the US with autism are taking a stimulant or a related medication like Strattera, because they do benefit, not the autism, but their self-regulation problems benefit. Medicines like stimulants don't know about diagnoses. They know about biochemistry. If I give the medicine and make the medicine a person, the medicine interacts with certain biochemistry in the brain. And it doesn't really matter what your diagnosis is. If enhancing that biochemistry helps you function better. And stimulants are performance enhancers. People function better when they take them. I'm not advocating we put it in the water, but very clearly people manage better, which is why stimulants are helpful for autism. They're used for refractory depression. Again, if you're not depressed, an antidepressant doesn't make you happier, but you can say I'm not inattentive, and a stimulant will help you pay attention better. They help everyone, which is why you can't use the medicine to prove that you have the problem. Now, a related question that I know you're going to ask is ADHD just a problem of behavior, which is why children with so many problems that are not ADHD can exhibit those behaviors, or is there a neuropsychological profile that will help us distinguish children with ADHD from other disorders? For example, are there certain patterns of performance on neuropsychological tests, tests that measure divided attention, tests that measure working memory, tests that measure attention to detail, or tests that measure timeliness, as on the MOXO, or hyperreactivity. And again, I'm their scientific consultant. I derive no profits from my work with them other than to be paid a consulting fee. So I'm not promoting the test as, oh, everyone with ADHD must have a MOXO. But I do think that the instrument can help us begin to appreciate the differences between children who can and children who don't or won't. So I had a boy yesterday, and I watched him take the MOXO, and I should tell you, he didn't want to be tested. He was difficult all day with me. And on the MOXO, he started out fine. But when I tracked his performance over time, very quickly, it was clear that he wasn't taking the test, or he was fooling around. And I had another child today who very clearly made an effort to take the test, there's a child with a brain injury whose attention score was good, whose impulsivity score was good, for those of you who know the MOXO, whose hyperreactivity score was fine, meaning the child wasn't just responding randomly all over the place, but his timeliness score was very low. And the child could not get in a pace, we call it processing speed, with the task. And so for me, this task was helpful in the differential diagnosis of understanding of, yes, this child is exhibiting the symptoms of ADHD, and maybe a stimulant would help, but his problem really isn't that he can't pay attention. His problem is that he can't process quickly enough. I think it's from his brain injury. He could have been like that even before his brain injury.
Basically, the continuous performance test in the studies that are published in the literature, this test has a high rank of differentiation from ADHD to non-ADHD. What is your experience and your knowledge about every continuous performance test, including MOXO?
Well,
Would
what
you
I can
use it as the main test or a complementary test?
Well, again, people need to understand that I'm a neuropsychologist, so I give a battery of tests. I measure intellect and neuropsychological abilities. I use a Luria model. Luria was the father of neuropsychology. One of the tests we developed looks at planning and attention to detail and thinking or simultaneous. That's some kind of interference. Yep. Okay. Or simultaneous ability. So for me, it isn't. I'm never testing just for ADHD. If a parent comes in and asks, I just want to know about ADHD, or I just want to know about learning disabilities, we send them someplace else. We do comprehensive evaluation so that we can see the world through the eyes of the child, not just to find the weaknesses or their liabilities, but also to understand what their strengths are. What we've demonstrated in our research is that what's wrong with you tells me where you are, but what's right with you tells me where you might go in life. And the more weaknesses or liabilities you have, the more important your strengths are, the more important it is that we try and help you be resilient. Now, in response to your question, what I can tell you is that some tests have good positive predictive power, meaning if you score poorly, you have the problem, the diagnosis. Some tests have good negative predictive power, meaning if you do well on the test, you don't have the diagnosis. Some tests have both, but some tests don't have both. Continuous performance tests, even the MOXO, from my understanding of the research that's been done, have good positive predictive power. If the child really attempts to take the test and they score poorly on attention and impulse control and timeliness and hyperreactivity, it doesn't have to be all of them, but they score poorly in a pattern that we see, they probably have trouble with the maturation of self-discipline. And when we look at their behavior in everyday life, that may translate to a diagnosis of ADHD. But the CPTs, the continuous performance tests, which were first developed to evaluate schizophrenia, the Connors, the Brain Train, the Gordon, I've been involved in research with all of them. They don't have good negative predictive power, meaning if you take the test and pass it, it doesn't mean you don't meet the diagnostic criteria for ADHD. It may simply mean you really like this test and you worked hard on it, excuse me, and you did well. What we know about children with ADHD is they know what to do, but they don't consistently do what they know. And on some tasks that they enjoy, even tasks that are supposed to identify children with impulse control and poor attention, they do well. Keith Connors, who developed the Connors questionnaires and the Connors CPT, who was a mentor of mine, he and I started the Journal of Attention Disorders together 23 years ago. Keith would joke that he did a little study with his CPT, and he tested the children once, and they didn't do very well. These were children with ADHD. And then he sat them down, and he showed them a box of really cool pencils. And he said, you can pick 3 pencils from this box if we do the test again, and you work harder. And most of the children had much better scores. And it wasn't bribery. They're not paying them to do something illegal. It's not blackmail. It's what we know about children with ADHD. They have a much higher threshold to bring their self-discipline online. And I'm a New Yorker by birth. I live in Salt Lake City now, but I'm very pragmatic. I have been known to take $5 out of my wallet for a child who seems to be doing poorly and put it on the table and tell the child, if you do this task better, and I really believe you're showing me what you can do, you have the $5. And almost always they do so much better, particularly when you ask them to copy designs, to look at their motor skills and motor perception. So what we know about ADHD is it's very responsive to motivation and interest. If it's boring, repetitive, effortful, uninteresting, doesn't have an immediate predictable payoff, nobody likes that. But most people can do it if required to do so. Children with ADHD have a very difficult time with that. They cannot. And that's really their problem. It isn't that they don't know what to do. It's that they need to go to a world like Disneyland, where everything is exciting and everything is interesting and every payoff is valuable. One last thing I'll tell you. My friend, Sydney Zintal. Sydney is a woman. She was at Indiana University. She's since retired. Sydney was a wonderful ADHD researcher. And she was looking for ways to help children with ADHD become more involved in school tasks. And she created all of these different experiments, including a classroom for ADHD that had lights and whistles and bells. And in order to make all that work, everybody had to be doing their, everybody had to be doing their work. And she demonstrated that most children with ADHD, if you make the task interesting and the payoff valuable, do far better, if that makes sense to you. They still have problems in everyday life. It doesn't transfer very well, but they clearly do better. ADHD is a problem of self-discipline. It's not really a problem of inability.
No se escucha, Julio. No te estamos escuchando.
Okay. Now
Ahí
yes,
está.
right? Okay.
Sí.
Following this feature of motivation, what is your knowledge and your position about Iowa gambling type tests regarding risk-benefit, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement? Is it related? What is your experience and position about it?
I missed what is it we're talking about that's negative or positive?
About the Iowa gambling test types, the risk-benefit test on ADHD.
Oh, I mean, I'm not familiar with clinical tests for risk-benefit. You mean like the gambling test? Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know of any tests like that for children. I know that those tests are available for adults, and we use some of those kinds of instruments to evaluate adults, particularly pilots and other people who are in highly demanding situations. But I don't do it for I don't do it for ADHD evaluations typically. My standard. Let's talk about that for a minute. With adults, particularly adults who have no history of learning disability, no history of intellectual deficits, think they have ADHD or had it when they were a kid and come in. I do a clinical interview, and the best way to understand people would be to follow them around for a day or two. I can't do that. So I do an interview. That's 1 to 2 hours. I have them fill out some questionnaires about themselves. If they have a spouse or a close family member, I will ask them to fill it out as well. So I get an observer view, because often we don't see ourselves the way other people see us. I will do a MOXO at this time. That's the test we're using. And I will also have them do a broad screen for mental health, like the MMPI or the Milan, just so I get a view of their overall personality style. There's a high incidence of depression, particularly in men with ADHD, a high incidence of anxiety in women with ADHD, maybe higher than the men. That's an adult evaluation. Now, if the adult tells me they have a history of learning disability, then I'm going to measure their intellect and neuropsychological functioning and achievement. I see a lot of people for what we call in the United States vocational rehabilitation. So these are people who are having trouble working for one disability or another, and they will ask specific questions about learning disability or autism or ADHD. Now, with the children, it's always a comprehensive evaluation. I'm sorry, but I think if you only have a hammer, the whole world is a nail. And so if you're only looking for ADHD, I'm not a big fan of clinics who hang up a sign, I evaluate ADHD. I think your false positive rate is going to be high just because that's the only population you're looking for. You're not willing to consider anything else. And so,
yes.
Go ahead.
Tell us a little bit about the problem of the youth, of the adults with ADHD, because in many countries, the belief is that ADHD is a child problem and it's not a general problem. Tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, so let's go back one step to where we started. So if you tell a parent your child's having problems because he has ADHD, and the parent asks, but why does he have ADHD? Most doctors answer, because he's having problems. Do you see the circular nature of that? He has ADHD. You and I know he has ADHD because he has an immaturity in what has been referred to as the efficiency, the braking system of his brain. The right prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, and the cerebellum, what we sometimes call the brain's braking system, the system you use to stop and think and problem solve. And it's immature, and we know that. And so when I try and explain this problem, I try and stay away from the label. The last thing I talk about with parents is what's the label. What we talk about is what's the process. I want you to see the world through the eyes of your child. I want you to understand how a child who may be late in speaking, how their personality and behavior and social relations will be developed. I want you to understand how a child who's having difficulty developing self-control and runs all over the place and disturbs all the adults everywhere you go, how people will respond to that child and what that child will come to think about themselves. In the end, for me, the child's mindset, their attitude, their belief about themselves, the ideas they carry about who they are into adult life is more important than anything else. So when people say children outgrow ADHD, it's a silly concept because adults have problems with impulse control. Adults have problems paying attention if it's boring or repetitive. Adults have problems sitting still. Maybe the diagnostic criteria are a little different. Maybe they change or shift a little bit, but problems with self-discipline are consistent throughout the lifespan. So anyone who says it's a childhood condition has to understand the history of how we study these conditions. You understand that 100 years ago, roughly 100 years ago or 75 years ago, we didn't think children had any mental health problems. We thought they were too immature to be depressed or anxious or schizophrenic We just thought they misbehaved. And conditions like depression and anxiety were studied in adults. And eventually we began to realize that children can have senses of hopelessness or worry, that children can experience the very same kinds of thoughts and feelings and impairments in their lives as adults experience. So there was a time when they said, oh, depression is an adult disorder. Children can't have it. Now we know that's not true. Maybe the symptoms are a little different, but we know it's not true. And ADHD, or hyperactivity, is a condition that we started studying in children. So now we've moved it up. It's an interesting phenomenon. Depression was an adult condition. ADHD or hyperactivity was a childhood condition. We said, oh, no, they don't exist in other times in life. And now we know, no, they really do. It's more a consequence of where we started our research. 50 years ago, there were scant studies on adult ADHD. Paul Wender, who was a mentor of mine here at the University of Utah, was one of the first to study adults with ADHD, and he had a somewhat different set of symptoms. He had a lot of emotional and behavioral symptoms that he thought characterized adults with ADHD different from children. So it's been an interesting progression. The same thing with autism. Autism was a condition we said only exists in children. Leave out the 2/3 of children with autism who have intellectual and developmental delays. Just look at the third who have normal intellect. 30 years ago, there were no studies of adults with autism. Where were those people? They were there. Nobody looked at them. They said they had a personality disorder. They were schizoid, or they said they were socially isolated, or whatever they said. Now we know. We just finished a pilot study, 500 adults, ages 18 through 80 with autism, as a foundation for our adult study where we're going to look at 5,000 adults, first in the general population, and then we're going to look at 500 to 1,000 adults with autism. And what do we find? The very same construct in children lasts all the way through adulthood. Problems with self-regulation, problems with social communication, problems with atypical behavior. The difference is that a lot of adults develop coping or camouflage behaviors, and people around them don't see it, but they know it inside. So if your diagnostic symptoms are what you see for adults with autism, you're not going to get it because they learn. I have adults that we follow who have the most interesting strategies. They keep lists of things to talk about with different people they know. They force themselves to look you in the face, even though they don't like doing it. It's fascinating, the strategies they develop. So on the outside, people think they're pretty normal, maybe a little quirky. But on the inside, they have just as much trouble reading people and monitoring themselves. So again, autism, like ADHD, is one of those conditions, starts with kids. But now we know all the way through age 80. And I'll tell you something else. In terms of vocational consistency, the group that's having the most trouble is the autistic group. I have people with college degrees who are very good at what they do who can't maintain employment. I just have an attorney I just saw. I hadn't seen him in 30 years. He came back to see me. He's in his 40s. He finished law school. He got married because he said, well, that's what you're supposed to do. He has a number of quirky hobbies. From the outside, people see him as a very nice, quiet guy. From the inside, he has no idea how to relate to people, and he's lost another job. They tell him he does very good work, but he doesn't talk to people, and clients find him a little strange. And he's lost another job, and now they've recommended he should get a job reviewing contracts or doing something where he doesn't have to interact with people.
Very interesting, Doctor. Tell us about executive functions and ADHD. Is ADHD mainly an executive functions problem? What is your position?
Okay, so let's first, in the time we have, define executive functioning, because there are dozens and dozens of theories. Jack and I edited a textbook on executive function. We invited everyone to propose their theories. And most of these theories are untested or supported by limited research. And so some people think executive functioning is 4 behaviors. Some think it's 20 behaviors. Some think it's 40 behaviors. we've done a number of large-scale studies, meaning thousands of people in the population. Others have done it as well. And executive functioning is really about efficiency. It's how you do what you do. Executive functioning is about any strategy you bring to improve performance. Do all the easy ones first on a math test. Control your emotions when something isn't going the way you want. Have a plan. Organize. Excuse me, I have an allergy. Get started. And anything that improves the outcome of your performance is under the umbrella of executive functioning. And what we demonstrated statistically is that executive functioning is one thing with lots of behaviors. It's how you do what you do. So when I talk about working with memory or working memory, when I talk about emotional regulation, initiation, organization, planning, these are behaviors that are used for a lot of things. When they are used to solve problems and function effectively in everyday life, we call them executive functions. But I prefer not to do that. So if executive functioning is about doing things strategically, then we would expect that children with ADHD don't have good executive functioning because they don't pay attention to detail and they're impulsive and they don't regulate their emotions and they don't start with a plan and they don't follow a plan. So all children with ADHD have problem with behaviors related to executive functioning, but not all children with problems with executive functioning have problems with ADHD. They don't all have ADHD. And in our studies, we've demonstrated if you take a group of teenagers who have depression and ask their parents and teachers and even them to fill out questionnaires about executive functioning, we developed a tool called the Comprehensive Executive Functioning Inventory. It's a parent, teacher, and a self-report, and it goes all the way through age 80, through childhood, age 5 through age 80. What we found was that these children who are in the midst of a depressive episode don't have good executive functioning. And as their depression lifts, their executive functioning gets better. Now, we could argue that maybe we could give them a face-to-face test, a planning test, an attention to detail test, even a MOXO, that might distinguish ADHD from other kinds of disorders with executive functioning problems. And I wish I could tell you that we've proven that, but we have not. Even the CPTs, even our questionnaire, is good at separating people with problems from people who don't have problems. But separating ADHD from depression, from anxiety, from autism, from personality disorders on the basis of an executive functioning test, we haven't proven we can do that very well. And the other thing I have to say is that when we talk about executive functioning as a behavior, it would appear to be very different than an executive functioning on a test that you or I might administer to a patient, because there's a very low correlation to how children perform or adults perform on a neuropsychological test like the Tower of London, which is a problem-solving test, or trail making, and how they're reported to be in everyday life. We sometimes see people who have trouble on these tests who in everyday life are not described as having behavioral problems related to executive functioning. We also see the other side of it. So I give these tests because I want to see how people function, but I don't use these tests, including the MOXO, to prove or disprove a diagnosis. I am just as likely to make a diagnosis of ADHD if the MOXO looks pretty normal as abnormal. I will say, more often than not, the MOXO is abnormal in ADHD. More often than not, the MOXO is abnormal when someone's had a brain injury. More often than not, the MOXO looks more normal when you're dealing with depression or anxiety or learning disability. But every case is different. You can't overgeneralize and make a set of rules from just one case.
Great. Doctor, please tell us about the interaction from a neuropsychologist with a child psychiatrist or a psychiatrist or a neuropediatrician. How is supposed to be the professional interaction between them?
Well, I can tell you, my clinic was started by myself and a child neurologist 40 years ago. This is the 40th year of our clinic. We actually now see 500 to 600 children a year and have been doing so for quite some time. And about half the children we see have brain injuries. We see some adults as well. So our approach has always been a team approach. Most practitioners don't have the opportunity to do that. Neuropediatricians, or in the US we refer to them as neurodevelopmental pediatricians, are sort of psychiatrists with pediatric background. Like a psychiatrist, they spend an hour with the family. But I have all of those people, the pediatrician, the psychiatrist, the neurodevelopmental physician, all of those medical doctors will refer to me for additional testing if they have any concerns that the problem extends beyond just ADHD. The other thing that has happened is that stimulants are so effective and their toxic to therapeutic dose is so wide, meaning children don't overdose on a stimulant, rarely have any side effects. I have no relationship with drug companies because I edit a science journal, so I'm not defending the use of medicine, but it's fairly common for pediatricians who are the primary diagnosticians, the first-line diagnosticians in the US for ADHD, to, based on a parent questionnaire and a teacher questionnaire and observing the child in the playroom. I can guarantee you, if in the exam room, I said playroom, if in the 10 or 15 minutes the pediatrician spends in the exam room, the child sits perfectly still and smiles and talks and doesn't move, I don't care what the questionnaires say, the pediatrician's not going to give the mother a prescription for Ritalin. More often than not, the prescription comes because the child can't sit still even in the exam room. And so for me, I don't have a problem when a pediatrician or a neurodevelopmental physician or a psychiatrist or a nurse practitioner, we don't have a lot of child psychiatrists in the US, is comfortable making a diagnosis of simple ADHD and starting a medical treatment or a parent program or a psychosocial treatment. But as you're well aware, less than 20% of children with ADHD have just that condition. And not because of genetic vulnerability, not so much because of family vulnerability, but if your self-discipline is poor, then any risk is going to be enhanced. If you have poor self-discipline and you worry a little bit, you're going to worry a whole lot. If you have a tendency to be emotional in the face of stress, you're going to be more emotional. If you have some trouble reading social cues and you have ADHD, you're going to have even more trouble. So co-occurrence or comorbidity is the rule for ADHD. And when we look at outcome over time, you would ask about that with ADHD, the children who have what I call simple ADHD, meaning their family life is normal, they don't have learning disability, they don't have emotional disorder, they don't have autism, they don't have an emerging personality disorder. For the most part, those children, when they grow up, do fine. They may still have some trouble in life, but for the most part, they do not define the 1/3 of children with ADHD who, as grown-ups, really struggle. I mean, we're well aware that having ADHD is not a blessing. It's not a benefit. For my Israeli colleague, it's not a mitzvah. Nobody should want to have ADHD. I'm not convinced Columbus or George Washington or great Americans, had ADHD. I think maybe they were a little impulsive, but they were very successful. And there were probably a lot of explorers who had ADHD who never made it. Their ship sank because they didn't know where they were going. But it's clearly not a blessing. Let me leave you with one last thought. We have just a few minutes, I'm told. But I want you to consider an interesting piece of research. There is an allele of a dopamine receptor gene. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain, helps the brain, billions of brain cells communicate. That allele receives a dopamine molecule. It's the 4 out of one of the 5 receptors. It's a modified receptor, DRD4 we call it, and that allele is associated with impulsive behavior. The paisas in Brazil who are 12 families who emigrated from Portugal, for whom they've studied now. There are thousands of relatives. When you study that gene variation in indigenous people going from the Inuit Eskimos who emigrated across the isthmus from Russia in Alaska, all the way down to the tip of South America, the occurrence of that gene in the population increases as you go down the indigenous people. So having a little bit of wanderlust, being a little impulsive, sometimes not always paying attention to what's in front of you, but to something else, may well have an evolutionary advantage. But having too much of that is clearly a disability in our society.
Excellent. Maybe one last question to this webinar. The title of the journal that you are the chief editor is Journal of Attention Disorders.
Yes.
Plural. Explain us why it's plural. It's of course one of the most important and with the highest scientific level at international level. But why disorders? As many disorders and not only ADHD.
So I'm not sure I understood the question. Were you asking about the Journal of Attention Disorders?
About the title of the journal is Disorders with an S.
It's Journal of Attention Disorder. It's Journal of Attention and Related Disorders, right? Let me stand up here and grab a journal. It is. Yeah, here's a copy. I'm very proud of this because it started as 4 issues a year, about 300 pages. It's now 2,000 pages a year, and it's 14 issues a year. And I didn't want to name it. Keith and I agreed we wanted to talk about the underlying process, not the diagnosis. It's not the Journal of ADHD. It's the Journal of Attention Disorders. And it's a journal of theoretical and applied science. So it's about the process of attention and self-regulation. And so we accept research that's broader than just ADHD, but of course that's going to be the primary submission. And if people are interested, if you go on my website, it's just samgoldstein.com, you can read the abstracts, the summaries of every issue. Every month, every time it comes out, the summaries are published on my website. You can go to the SAGE website, and we receive right now 600 to 700 submissions a year. There are researchers all over the world. There is a research group in Iraq doing research on ADHD. There's research groups in Africa, in small countries in Africa. It's fascinating, the research that's being done. And so I have issues that are on one topic. This particular issue that from February that recently came out is on just medication treatment in adults with ADHD. So these are very good resources. If participants just want to read the abstracts, you can read them and understand the science. One study doesn't prove a theory, but you can get a pretty good feel for what's happening in the field by just reading the abstracts every month, and they're available for free. You don't have to subscribe to the journal.
Great. Ari, do you have a final question?
Well, I just wanted to, well, first of all, Sam, I just want to thank you.
I'm happy to do it.
Your answers are so refreshing and so on the spot that I really enjoyed it.
And I look forward when all of this craziness settles down. I look forward to returning to Mexico City, and we'll do work for parents, and we'll do work for clinicians, and we'll do work for our hearts as well as our minds.
I love to have you in Mexico. I'm looking
I'll
forward
look forward to it. Yes, for sure. Everybody should stay healthy and be well.
Oh, amen. Thank you. Now, I'm gonna speak in Spanish now, just to close a little bit. Recibimos muchas preguntas de todos ustedes. Les agradecemos mucho por sus preguntas. No nos dio tiempo de contestarlas ahora, pero vamos a escoger de todas las preguntas las que engloben la curiosidad principal y las dudas principales. Y yo ya hablé con Sam, se las vamos a mandar, él va a responderlas y las vamos a publicar en Facebook para que todos tengan acceso a todas las respuestas, todo lo que podamos hacer. Una disculpa que al final no nos dio tiempo, pero bueno, la verdad es que las preguntas estaban muy buenas. So, thank you very much, Sam. Thank you very, very much, Julio. It was amazing.
Welcome.
Buenas noches, Julio. I will look forward to meeting you in person.
Me too, Dr. Sam. I hope we meet soon in Mexico or elsewhere in the world.
I hope so. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you all. Gracias a todos. Buenas noches. Buenas tardes. Ah, una última, no sé si ya se desconectaron, pero les vamos a mandar un correo como un gesto de agradecimiento a todos por haber participado. Tenemos unos descuentos especiales que hay para todos los participantes. Los pueden, los pueden bajar, los van a recibir por correo. Y bueno, les agradezco mucho y espero que aprovechen la oportunidad. Un gran saludo a todos. Buenas noches. Buenas tardes en México. Hasta luego.